So I'm really pleased to welcome Charlie Gilmore, who is the History and Social Studies Subject Matter Specialist at the Sacramento County Office of Education. Is that right, Charlie? Have I got it right?
You got it right.
Okay, great. Well, that's the first hurdle over. And of course, Paul Murray, who's driving the whole thing, our technical guru here. And so the idea of this webinar is to go a bit deeper to the learning that we began in the face-to-face sessions. And as we talked about learning goals and success criteria in the face-to-face sessions, what I wanted to do here with our subject matter expert is to really delve into learning goals and success criteria in the context of social studies. And this is the last one in the webinar series. We've done math, science, English language arts, and last but not least, history and social studies. So let's move to the first slide, because we really want to think about what are our learning goals for today. And specifically, I mentioned several times in the face-to-face session the importance of disciplinary learning, disciplinary knowledge, and locating the learning goals and success criteria in the context of disciplinary content and disciplinary practices, and the integration of the two. So that's going to be a focus, understanding how disciplinary knowledge supports learning goals and success criteria. And then the second goal we have is to understand how progressions are important for learning goals and success criteria. And Charlie's going to talk a little bit about, I hope, how the progression across grade levels in social studies, or even within grade levels in social studies. And then I've put together some learning goals and success criteria, so that'll come at the end for us to think about, well, how do these stack up as learning goals and criteria in the context of what we now know about disciplinary practices and conceptual understanding. And so, of course, we need the success criteria. So your job will be to explain disciplinary considerations for learning goals and success criteria in the context of social studies. So any of your colleagues who aren't here today, you can tell them what that is. Be able to describe to them how progressions support learning goals and success criteria. And then in our final segment of the webinar, to be able to use this knowledge to identify stronger and weaker goals, and then say why you think they're stronger or weaker goals and criteria. So that's our guide for today. And I want to begin with some just quick reminders. I don't want to spend a long time on this, but just to refresh our memory so we all know where we're coming from about formative assessment. And I use this slide in the face-to-face session, and you can see that it's the term used to describe a type of assessment where the focus is on informing learning. So it's happening during the learning to inform ongoing learning, rather than doing a test or an assessment at the end of a period of learning to figure out, what have kids actually learned. And it's, as I mentioned, it's focused on learning as it's taking place. So while kids are engaged in their social studies learning, whatever the conceptual understandings, whatever the practices are, that's going to be the focus of a formative assessment as they're developing their knowledge and skills. And of course, the ultimate purpose is to keep that learning moving forward throughout the lesson, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4 class periods, so that you end up meeting the intended goal and criteria. So that's just a quick reminder of why formative assessment is important. And I sprinkled the face-to-face presentation with some of these quotes from teachers responding to the prompt, I used to, but now I. And this was a teacher, I can't remember where the teacher was from actually, but this teacher commented after about a year of implementing formative assessment that I used to think that formative assessment was just checking for understanding, but now I think it's an integral part of the lesson plan and essential to reaching learning goals. So I really think this particular teacher captures the purpose of formative assessment. It's not just checking for understanding, did kids understand or didn't they understand, but more to the point, what part of the goal do they understand? What part of the concept or the practice I'm trying to help them learn are they understanding at this point, and what do I need to do to keep that learning advancing? So I think this teacher captured that really nicely. So next slide, please, Paul. So, Miriam, you ought to be able to say these out loud without any prompting, although I have to tell you that the people on the webinar yesterday couldn't do it. So I won't ask you, I'll just remind you. So the three guiding questions to frame the process of formative assessment are, where am I going? And that is the learning goals and success criteria. What do I as a teacher want my kids to learn in this lesson? And similarly for a student, what am I going to learn in the lesson, and how will I know if I've learned it? And I bolded that because we're still in that red zone. We're going to think more about these goals and criteria in the context of subject matter today. And then the next question, okay, I know where I'm going. So as I'm learning during this lesson, at a particular point in the lesson, where am I? What have I understood? Have I partially understood something? Am I close to meeting the goal? Am I confused? Do I have a misconception? Where am I now? So I need to understand that as a teacher, but as a teacher, I need to help students understand their own learning as well. And then the third question, where to next? Okay, if here's where I am now, what do I as a student need to do, and what does a teacher need to do to support me to continue to move forward in the lesson? And if you remember, I'm hoping you do, that the whole point of these three questions is to really help teachers and students together to close the gap. And as I explained in the face-to-face session, this isn't the achievement gap. Unfortunately, we still have an achievement gap. But this is a conception in work by an Australian scholar, Royce Sadler, the idea being that kids start at a point at the beginning of a lesson, there's a destination point at the end of a lesson, and so between the start and the end, there's a gap. And the whole idea of formative assessment is to close that gap so that students end up where we want them to be. So this idea of closing the gap then is operationalized through this feedback loop. And I explained this in the session, in the face-to-face session. You can see those three questions. Where am I going? Where am I now? Where to next? And so this feedback loop is a continuous process that operates just as part of doing business in a classroom. So we're going to keep in the red zone, and I wasn't able to talk much about the building blocks in the, yeah, thanks Paul for the arrow, reminding us the whole point is to close that gap. So kids are consistently meeting the goals that we set for them. Or indeed they set for themselves. And so what we have here is this idea of building blocks. What are those chunks of learning along the way that are going to be the focus of both instruction and formative assessment that are going to accumulate so that students are actually meeting the standards? And then the question from the building blocks is that that teachers can, well, it's not a question, I was going to frame it as a question, but teachers can say, I know what my students are learning. And the second one is I'll know how I will know if they've learned it. So it's deciding what's the learning target, the objective, the intention, the goal. Doesn't really matter what you call it, provided it specifies what kids are learning in the lesson. And then the criteria, those are the indicators or learning performances that will help them know if they've learned it. So I didn't use this quote in the face-to-face session. But I think it's a particularly powerful one from a very famous psychologist who, you can see this is 1971. She died many years ago, but I think she left a very powerful legacy. And this quote really speaks to me, what Mary Alice White said about likening a student's experience in school to a sailing ship on an unknown sea to an unknown destination. And what she said was, a child only knows he's going to school. Very quickly, the daily life on board ship becomes all important. The daily chores, the demands, the inspections become the reality, not the voyage, nor the destination. And so I think what she's trying to say here, that for so many students in school, and I realize this was 1971, but I still think it's relevant today, so many kids don't even know what journey they're on and what the final destination is for them. And so that's really the role that learning goals and success criteria play. They demystify the voyage so that it doesn't become just a set of busy work that doesn't amount to very much at the end of the day. So I think this is particularly relevant to our considerations today. Miriam, I don't know if you have any comments or questions at this point. Let me just pause and see either in the chat box if you're on a computer, or we can unmute you.
I'm okay. We're good.
Okay, great. So here we are then on that voyage with the learning goals and the success criteria. And of course, part of the voyage is for kids, if you can click Paul, to know what they're learning and how they'll know if they've learned it. So they're clear what the destination is, and they'll know when they've arrived. And so that demystifies the whole idea of being in school, which, you know, for many kids is just a fog. I do this. It's like the chores on the ship. I do this and I do that and do the other. And why am I? Well, who really knows? So this brings us back to the disciplinary knowledge that teachers have that grounds the development of these building blocks and then the goals and criteria. And these obviously are going to differ discipline by discipline. And so the knowledge that you want kids to have in social studies is going to be different from the knowledge in math. Same with the concepts, same with the analytical practices, although I do notice that Charlie has, and it seems to be across the board in the standards, is using evidence, arguing from evidence. So that's one analytical practice. And then particular skills that we want students to acquire. And so when teachers have this kind of knowledge, at least our experience suggests, is they're better able to develop those rigorous goals and criteria that really are embedded in deep disciplinary knowledge and get kids to important destinations so that learning is worthwhile and that learning gets students to the ultimate goal of meeting the standards. Miriam, can you tell us, does your school follow the California standards, or are you loosely associated with them in your social studies curriculum? How does it work at your school?
We usually use the California history standards.
Okay, well, I hope Paul's happy. Charlie's happy to hear that. I see him smiling. Good. So this is great, because I think Charlie's going to draw from those standards when he talks a little bit more about disciplinary learning. So thank you for that. What grade level do you teach, Miriam?
I teach 5th grade.
5th. Okay. Okay, good. How big is your school? We've had teachers who
our school's like 600-700 students.
Oh, so you have
it's K through 12.
Oh, I see. So you probably don't have many classes at each grade level then.
No, we don't, no.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, good to know. All right, so let's go to the next, having set the scene for that. Let's continue, Paul. I'm going to ask Charlie to talk about some of the disciplinary considerations, thinking about HSS in terms of curriculum, instruction, and formative assessment. So could you speak to these for us, Charlie, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you know, as you follow the California state standards, we've had the same content standards since 1998, and there hasn't been any shift in that. So at 5th grade, for example, early American history is the content that's being taught. But in 2016, California adopted a new framework instructing or helping teachers understand how to teach to those standards. And there have been some pretty significant shifts in instructional practices in the realm of history, social science with this new framework adoption. The shifts, I think, can best be remembered with the acronym CLIC, C-L-I-C, in that as a history teacher, we want to focus on 4 areas of instruction. The content, which is still important and is kind of the driver of the vehicle of what we teach. But we're also tasked with teaching literacy through history, social science, inquiry, and civic action or citizenship through our social studies curriculum. And so what I have here is a little bit of the inquiry design model that we're being asked to use in the teaching of history, social science. And this is really driven from kind of, I would say, the technological advancements that we've gone through in the last decade or so, where the content information is out there for students. They can Google and they can find all sorts of a wealth of information about history. But what do they do with that information is really kind of the question that's confronting history teachers today. So we want to teach students how to form an inquiry into history and use that inquiry to better understand history and better communicate conclusions from history. So the inquiry design model in the framework has 4 key steps in it. The first one is to work with students to develop appropriate questions. We call these either compelling questions or essential questions. And these might be kind of open-ended, debatable, engaging, intriguing questions about history. So one that, delves into early American history could be something like, was the American Revolution truly revolutionary? That's a question that different people might have different answers to as they study history. So working with students to develop a question like that that's intriguing and engaging, and then develop a plan on how they're going to actually answer that question. Once they have the plan, if we could hit the next bullet, we have to work with students to determine what are the appropriate disciplinary tools that they can use and apply to the answering of that question. So if we're talking about the American Revolution, that actually hits kind of all 4 major disciplines that fall under history, social science. We have the political or civic aspect to it. When we talk about the intolerable acts and the taxes that were being, the Stamp Act and the taxes that were being put on the colonists, we have an economic angle with the geography, the distance across the Atlantic Ocean between Great Britain and the colonies and how that affected the revolution. And then of course the historical tools that we use, things like evaluating multiple perspectives from the time period and how different people, say patriots and loyalists, may have looked at different actions. So we work with students to determine kind of what are the best lenses or the tools to use as they plan their inquiry. And once they've done that, students will gather and evaluate evidence. So there's a whole bunch of material out there on any sort of historical topic. And we have to work with students to help them determine what materials or evidence or sources out there are the best and the most reliable pieces of information that they can use to help them answer that question that's guiding their inquiry. So they would work through different types of primary sources and secondary sources to help them gain greater insight into that question. And then once they have that, the final part of this inquiry design is that students need to communicate their conclusions. Basically, they're answering their initial question. They are making an argument. Usually it takes the form of an argumentative sort of piece. And then you can communicate that conclusion in a bunch of different fashions. There's the tried and true, piece of thoughtful, deep writing, but it can also be done through discussion, presentation, debate, projects, that sort of thing. And then what we're really is kind of a new and kind of final component to this is, should it lend itself towards it? Can students take informed action in the present day based upon their study of history through civics and that sort of thing? Is there an issue faced in history, whether it's about improper taxation or something like that, or tyranny, lack of freedom of speech, lack of the freedoms that the colonists may have faced? Is there something they can connect that to in the present day, and then take a sort of civic action, maybe write a letter to a representative, or go speak at a school board meeting or something like that, where we teach them how to then become responsible citizens and act appropriately within the American democracy. Any questions on that?
Miriam, do you have questions?
No.
I think that's for me, Paul. Actually, Charlie, can you go back? Can you go back one, Paul? I think that's very helpful. This inquiry model is resident. I was going to say it's similar, but resident of the inquiry model of the other disciplines as well, as I see it. So it's almost a huge thrust across all the standards that kids are asking questions and applying the tools and evaluating evidence and creating arguments and then communicating conclusions. So, I think this seems to be a theme across so many standards, but it's very specific in social studies, as in all the disciplines, to the disciplinary nature of actually what you want them to be doing. That was really helpful. I feel I've learned a lot about, maybe Miriam knew this already, but I've learned a lot about social, you call it social science, history, social science. I call it history, social studies. Okay, well, I go back
and forth between the two, to tell you the truth.
Oh, you do? There's not a correct one. Okay, well, that's really helpful. And so thinking about learning goals, then you would want the learning goals to reflect some of these disciplinary considerations depending on the focus of the lesson. And this is all being undertaken in the context of the American War of Independence, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
that's the example that I was using, but compelling questions throughout U.S. and
yeah, but I'm saying that's the one we've used. Just remind me, because we use a different preposition in the UK. So Americans say the War of Independence or for Independence?
That's a really good question. The American for Independence, I think.
Yeah, and the British say of Independence. There must be some political reason in that. But it's true.
A War of Independence might be the proper way of putting it now that
Okay, well, it's a bit awkward being a Brit on the phone when you're discussing all of that. I'll just sort of pass over the whole thing. But that's really helpful. So whatever the content is you're learning about the particular time and period, this inquiry thread is throughout it. So that's good to know. Helpful, Miriam, right?
Yes.
Good. So we go to the next slide then. Thank you. Thanks, Paul. So the goal here then is, the reason I put this up is because I think the charge has been leveled at American education for a long time that, kids learn these discrete atomistic bits and pieces that don't really amount to very much. So, for example, you'll have to help me out here, Paul. They may learn some facts in history, and then they may learn some more facts, but there's no connectivity between these facts, or there's no real thinking about cause and effect. There's none of this inquiry thread in it. I think particularly in math and science, this has been true, and indeed in English language arts. I don't know if it's been as bad as that in social science, Charlie. What would you say? Is this something that you think is a concern?
I would say that the idea of like cause and effect, causation, that sort of thing has been part of the historical teaching for a long time. So connecting, this event happened and which led to this event.
Yeah.
But I think where the shift is happening these days is identifying the broader themes that can really go throughout long periods of history. So teaching through themes like the meaning of liberty, or when did Americans truly gain their freedom or their liberty? And depending on how you define that concept, there you could come up with many different answers to it. Some people might say when we gained our independence, but then if you take into the perspective of, say, slaves or women who didn't have the right to vote during that time, that they had gained their liberty. So then you can take that thread through the Civil War, through the Civil Rights movement, and through other movements that are still going on today towards providing liberty for all groups of people.
Mm-hmm. So that's I don't know if I'd call it a progression, but a theme that's applicable across so much time in history and so many events. So that would be a sort of piece of connectivity. Is that the idea? Yeah. And so
and then to really provide the relevance to today, in a sense, too. When you're talking with students about something that took place hundreds of years ago, why is it relevant? And I think if you can really identify those overarching themes that are still resonant today, it helps engage the student in understanding the importance of what they're learning.
Yes, and that was another theme of the face-to-face session we had when Miriam was there, was, it's what am I learning? How will I know if I've learned it? And why am I learning it in the first place? So it does bring in that relevance. So that's really helpful. As I say, social studies or social science, or whatever we call it, I'll call it social studies, has never been an area of expertise for me. So this is really instructive. And I think the idea of these themes and connecting events across time and giving a reason for it really is a way of avoiding all this discrete learning, which has been very emblematic of many other disciplines. So next slide, please, Paul. So in avoiding that, then, what we're trying to think about, and I'd like you to help me think about this with Miriam, Charlie, how this works in social studies, because the idea of the building blocks is that you imagine that you've got, the far, I'm moving my cursor, but Paul, I'm sure nobody can see it, but on the stone, the top, oh, here we go, Paul's doing his fancy footwork again, thank you. The idea of that voyage, that journey, that pathway, from where the students are now, and what are those incremental shifts in thinking, or the incremental developments in skills or the analytic practices that are going to occur as students are engaged in learning about either the theme, the topic, evaluating sources, or whatever they're doing within that social studies context. And so the destination is at the top left hand of the slide, the image. The starting point would be the bottom right. And the idea of these building blocks, and why Paul put in the blue, I guess, what are they called? Well, rectangles, is to show that they are connected, that what students are learning in one lesson builds in the next, builds in the next, builds in the next, and so on. So it's not that these are just discrete lessons. I'm learning about this, okay, done, check. Now I'm learning about that. But you get into much deeper learning, much more substantive learning. And so these incremental points of development in children's thinking and in their skills become the focus for the lesson and the focus, obviously, for formative assessment. So it's important to understand this big development, both across standards and within standards as well. So next slide, please, Paul. And this is basically saying the same thing. So I called it a learning progression, but what is the progression that students are going to traverse from the starting point of this series of lessons where, you know, I've got goal 1, but it's going to connect to lesson goal 2, which connects to lesson goal 3, because at the end of the day, we want kids to walk away with substantive learning and not just bits and pieces that don't amount to any deep understanding and the kind of application that Charlie was talking about to, you know, their own civic life. And so this is really what I mean by the building blocks. How do we trace out in the course, you know, either with colleagues or the curriculum or through analyzing standards, what are these building blocks? What are the sort of significant changes in student thinking that are going to occur as they move from one standard to the next? And it really, next slide, please, Paul. And it's sort of, oh yeah, I've tried to convey that, you know, the concepts, the analytical practices, the skills. And you can think about this in 2 ways. So let's think about it, Miriam, as your 5th grade class. So they begin with a little seed there as you're introducing new ideas, new knowledge, new concepts, new skills. And throughout the course of the year with you, they're adding to that incrementally so that they thrive, they flourish, and they end up as a beautiful tree. So, and these are these building blocks that help nurture the growth. But you can also think about this as K-12. And you know, okay, you come in kindergarten, and what are you learning in kindergarten? When I taught kindergarten, it used to be people who help us. And I think it's the same sort of thing, isn't it, Charlie, in the standards that kindergartners are thinking about their local community and...
Right. It starts with kind of, yeah, really around them and their place in the local community. And then the progression through elementary or lower elementary is broadening their understanding of larger communities in their time or their place in time and space.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's still the same as when I taught a million years ago. But we did call it people who help us. It was really understanding the local. Remember, we used to start with the school, you know, the classroom, and who helps us, you know, how does a community get formed and all of that. Anyway, enough of reminiscing. But the idea, Miriam, is to show how this gets more sophisticated. So by the time they're in 12th grade, you know, they should be well prepared to understand the lessons of history and take their place in a democratic society. Would you say that right, Charlie, or are those lofty goals?
That would be great.
So does that make sense to you, Miriam? Do you have any comments or questions about that? Or Charlie, do you have any additional thoughts?
No, I'm okay. Taking notes and listening.
Does it make sense to you? Can you not see the slides, Miriam?
No, I can't see anything. I can just hear you.
Oh, because this is such a nice slide, and it's got this little seed.
But I hope I can get emailed to me.
Yeah, I think Paul will make sure that you do. But it starts a little seed, and then it's got a tree growing, and right at the end, either at the end of the time they've been with you in 5th grade or the end of their time in school, they're just a beautiful tree with lots of lovely leaves and a strong, sturdy trunk. So I'm sorry you can't see the image. Anyway, it must be hard to just listen, so you're doing a great job. So next slide, please. Yeah, and that's the idea of progression. And so this image, Miriam, is a screen of a GPS. You know, so the pathway. We've had a boat, a sailing ship on a voyage. We've had a tree growing, and now we've got an image of a roadway, a direction being taken on a GPS screen. But again, all these images come to the same point, that we know where kids are going on in the lesson, and then how does this lesson fit within that longer voyage so they get to the destination that we want them to. And those are all the considerations to be thinking about in social studies. So next slide, please, Paul. Now this is going back to Charlie. I don't know if you have the standards handy, but maybe Charlie, you can help Miriam visualize these standards without the screen. But we will make sure you get the slides, I promise.
So what's on the screen right now is taken from the C3 framework, the College Career and Civic Readiness framework that was adopted by the National Council for Social Studies. And really it has a few dozen, I would say, kind of progression, K-12 progressive skill building sort of standards that it wants teachers to keep in mind as the students move through their social studies learning. And so it kind of has stopping points at the end of lower elementary, upper elementary, middle, and then high school. And the one that I chose to kind of highlight here, because I do think it's something that is really relevant to the skills we want to see in our civically ready students or adults by the time they finish teaching. And that's how to kind of help students understand how to determine which sources are the most helpful in answering their inquiries or their the questions that are driving their studies. So it kind of has its first touch point at the end of second grade, talking about just, you know, when students might have a sort of compelling question in front of them, say in first or second grade, it might be, why do we have rules? Then helping them to kind of identify, like, what would I be looking for to help me answer this question? What are the sort of sources that I would want? If I want to learn why we have rules, would it be good for me to maybe ask questions of an adult, of a teacher, or of a principal or somebody like that at my school site, or a parent? What are the sources that would be best, you know, as opposed to turning to the student sitting in the desk next to me and asking what his or her opinion is on the matter? What are the most helpful sources? And then that learning progresses as the students get older. You can't see this necessarily since you don't have the screen in front of you, but as they get older, I've bolded kind of the additions or the changes to the standards. So in fifth grade, determining what kind of sources are the most helpful is still part of the standard, just like it is in second grade. But now we're asking students to take into consideration different opinions people might have on how to answer that question. That when you ask an open, kind of compelling question, you're not necessarily going to get the same answer from everybody or from every source that you look at. And then by the end of middle school, we want to kind of consider multiple points of view before we draw our own conclusions. And then by the end of high school, really, that we want to, it's kind of blocked on me a little bit here, but that we want to make sure we've got a variety of sources, and that we recognize the different uses of those sources, or the potential uses of those sources. So really, we're taking a skill that I would say is very relevant to how students interact as citizens in a democracy, or as adults interact as citizens in a democracy. And we're showing that in history, social science, we're building those skills from the start in kindergarten, and they're progressively getting more and more advanced, or more and more sophisticated as the students progress through their education. And on the next slide, what was it? I took an historical skill. So we have the four lenses that social studies, social science go through, with civics, economics, geography, and history. And so I took an historical disciplinary tool as an example, and that's change, continuity, and context. So students understanding that. And this is it's another skill that progresses regardless of whether you're teaching social studies in lower elementary, US history, world history, government or economics. This is a skill that progresses K-12. And so it starts with, in lower elementary, students learning how to sequence events and understand first came this, second came that. And then moving into, by the end of 5th grade, where your students are at, being able to not just sequence events, but sequence events that are related to each other. So making that determination of whether or not things have some relation, some causation, cause effect relation to each other, and to look at things that happened at the same point in history, and make comparisons about two things or multiple things that may have happened at the same point in history. And then from there, their learning becomes more sophisticated as they begin to analyze those connections, not just recognize them, but to start with that kind of deeper thinking and analysis, and to start recognizing that similar developments or connected developments in a broader historical context. And then by the end of their schooling in K-12, we really want them to start to be evaluative of historical events, and really understand what shapes unique circumstances in time and place, to really get a more sophisticated understanding of what causes change, what causes things maybe to not change, the continuity, and then the broader context that these historical events happen in. So it's really these thinking skills that we kind of grow throughout the students' K-12 education.
Yeah, that's really useful, Charlie. Thank you. So maybe we can, at the risk of putting you on the spot, but is there a way that you could frame a learning goal for a lesson within one of these grade bands for history?
So
engage kids in thinking, that signal to them this is going to be about thinking, this lesson.
Try and see if I can think of an example. What I would say with the learning goals in this, and in my work with history teachers, social studies teachers, is where we find it easy to create learning goals is in the content, right? I can identify who the first president of the United States was. That sort of learning goal where they can understand the content, and we can tend to either forget or spend less time working on the skill-based learning goals like we're seeing here. And so that is something that I would want to just kind of plug, that we want to make sure is included when we're thinking through learning goals and success criteria in history instruction. To be on the spot for...
Well, you don't have to do it on the spot. I think that's helpful, that it's not just, a content goal, but that, I like what you said about the thinking skills and to create these, obviously I call them analytic practices, you call, social studies obviously calls them skills, within that particular discipline, but to make sure that these are as much a part of a goal as knowledge of history, I think is an important message that we need to convey to our social studies teacher colleagues. So that's a good reminder that, when you are framing learning goals and you're thinking about instruction, it should include, I don't know if I put it in this, maybe it was another PowerPoint I was doing, but it was another one. I have a Venn diagram that shows the overlap in disciplines between, which I think is the same in all disciplines, between the actual conceptual understanding and the disciplinary practices or skills, and they become integrated. And so I think that's, equally the case. That I've learned that in social studies, and it's really important to make sure that as you're conceptualizing learning goals, those two components are part of creating that rich learning opportunity for kids and getting to where you want them to be. Have I said that right, Charlie? Is there anything?
Oh, that was great.
Yeah, you'll have me as your social studies student now, will you? Well, this has been great learning for me. I hope for you as well, Miriam, although you do teach social studies, so you probably know a lot of this. But I think it's good to be reminded. Do you have any comments or thoughts or questions for Charlie? You know, it's not often you get a subject matter expert all to yourself.
Not right now, no.
I know, as soon as you get off this call, you'll be thinking, oh, I wish I'd asked him this, and I wish I'd asked him that. Well, it'll help once you have the slides, and because what Charlie's done on this slide, which you can't see, he bolded how each grade band, what the progression is, so what you would expect the advance in each grade band to be on the previous one. And so important considerations for learning goals. Because the other thing, Charlie, I mean, I was thinking other disciplines, and I think social studies is just the same, that when you are teaching something, you're teaching with an eye to the future as well, not just with the, you know, the here and now, but how does this fit? What kind of foreshadowing do I need to do of things that are maybe coming further along the line, but the genesis of which it begins here and now. So I think this kind of work is really important. We had a great one from the ELA colleague yesterday. Do you have these done in any other form like this that Miriam could have, so it would help us see it? Because I know the folks who are on the webinar for the ELA really loved this, how they could see how it builds over time.
We could definitely do that, because it's pretty easy to pull from the framework and then to just kind of make these bolded call outs of where the changes happen. And really even, I think, as important to see the unbolded similar parts, the parts that continue the same throughout the progression. I'd be more than happy to create a document with that in it, because I think it would have a lot of use.
Oh, I think it would. Certainly, I'll take it, you know, let them know at the face-to-face sessions that that's going to be available, and that the ELA one is available, because it is important. Paul says he's going to post it on the website. Super. So we can, thank you, Charlie. I know this is work for you being on this webinar. I didn't think you'd end up with extra work, but I think that'll be really useful for the field, because you can really see the development of, you know, what's the same and how does it increase in complexity and sophistication.
Yeah, that would be great. I think you'd get a lot of mileage out of something.
I think it would. So Paul said on the chat, I'll post on the website. Oh my goodness, the one which has all of the ELA standards is already up. Oh, fantastic. On the CAPSPDNow.com website. That's great, Paul. You are a mover and a shaker. Thank you.
And I do have another one that I've created in the past that it's 612 only, but it's the Common Core literacy standards for history and social science. We don't, K5, there's no separate literacy standards. They follow with the ELA standards. But I do have that already made, so I can share that as well.
That would be fabulous, because I do know we have some high school social studies folks. In fact, we had one on the webinar yesterday, but he couldn't be on this webinar, and I think he'd be super interested in that.
Great.
So, yeah, you've definitely got an audience. Thank you. Sound good, Miriam?
Yes, we're good.
Great. Okay, let's continue. Looking at the time here. Yeah, so the what I've got here, Miriam, on the image is two glasses with a goldfish jumping from one glass to the other. And the idea behind this image is that what we really want students to do is to be able to transfer their knowledge and skills to novel situations. So the kinds of conceptual understandings, the kind of skills they're developing in social studies, you know, and I think when you were talking, Paul, about these, Charlie, about the themes, they can transfer these ideas from, you know, women's suffrage to slavery to civil rights to whatever the context. They're able to evaluate and think about the historical time and place with these concepts and these skills. I don't know if you want to add to that, but I think we often forget, maybe you don't, but I know a lot of people do, that the whole goal here is transfer, generalizability. Are they learning so that they can transfer this understanding and skills into new contexts? You know, which is informed citizens is something that they should be able to do. At least I think so. Do you have any additional thoughts on that, Charlie, from your expert perspective?
Well, I would say, like, when I was in the classroom, one of the questions that I asked my students, and I was at the high school level, but is, you know, the government spends a whole lot of money teaching, making sure that history and social studies are taught to students. Why do they do that? You know, if it's not relevant to today. And so it's because a democracy needs an informed citizenry. Like that's the point of teaching history. I would say more so than those discrete pieces of information that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, and can they use this these knowledge and skills in their everyday life, going beyond school? You know, it's pretty foundational to a democracy. So next slide. Oh, questions and comments. So over to you, Miriam. I don't want you to make you ask questions if you're feeling overwhelmed with all this information and ideas at this point. But just want to give pause in case you have any comments you want to make, or think about your own teaching, or ask any questions.
I don't have any questions right now.
What is this making you think about? Is it making you think about anything, or are you just taking it all in?
Kind of reflect on my teaching of social studies, and it's going the right way.
Great. Well, hopefully this webinar and Charlie's expertise is going to help you reflect even more on your teaching. And, you know, when we get back to thinking about learning goals and success criteria, that you'll have some considerations now that have been raised from the disciplinary perspective about what you should be thinking about with respect to your social studies teaching. So let's continue. So I want to remind you, and you heard this already, but I think it bears repeating, about what are the criteria for a good learning goal. And the first one, which I mentioned in the face-to-face, was that the learning goals are clear and they're linked to the big picture of learning. And that's a lot of what we've been talking about today, that big picture of social studies learning. So that it's not just a little isolated island in a big sea, but it actually is part of a larger framework. I know I'm mixing my metaphors horribly today, but it's, you know, going back to that graph, oh, you couldn't see it, but the idea of one goal connecting to the next and the next and so on, that you're building something of substance. So it's clear, linked to the big picture, and so the purpose and the context for learning, that it's focused on the learning and not on the doing. So kids should be able to say, here's what I'm learning today, and here's why I'm learning it, and here's how I'll know if I'm learning it. And in fact, the social studies teacher, Nathan, that was on yesterday, he said, you know, he reflected that so many of his kids come into the class and say, what are we doing today? And I said, your goal, Nathan, is to transform your students so that when they come in the classroom, they're saying, what are we learning today? Because I think it's more than a semantic difference. So And then, of course, we need, if we're focusing on learning, and going back to Mary Alice White and that quote about the voyage and the destination, we need to help students understand what it is they're learning. And I think when we get to the third session and we really focus on the student role in all of this, student assessment, self-assessment, peer feedback, the importance of being communicated from the student's perspective, and really spending time helping students understand what the learning goal entails. What does it mean to learn this? And why should I care? As we discussed in the face-to-face session, that it's realistic and time limited for the purposes of formative assessment. It's not that we can go a whole year and then give them the state test at the end of the year, or go 6 weeks and give them an interim benchmark test. We need to be focused on where they are minute by minute, day by day, so that we're not losing kids. Kids aren't falling down holes that they can't get out of. So from the point of view of formative assessment, it's really making sure that the goals are manageable within the context of one lesson, and so that we as teachers can keep focused on how that learning is developing, how those skills are developing, how that knowledge is developing, and we can make adjustments and respond in ways that keep kids on track. And then finally, and this in a way goes back to what I was saying earlier about atomistic, discrete learning experiences, that what we want is for kids to engage in rich, productive learning experiences. So goals should really, really promote rich, productive learning experiences. And I think the kinds of things Charlie's been talking about with the, not just the knowledge of history, but some of these practices or skills associated with working within the historical context, really enrich kids' experience and lead to that transferable knowledge and skills. So that's a reminder of what makes a good learning goal. Hope you remember that, Miriam, from the session. The answer is yes, you do.
Yeah.
Good.
I remember learning.
Good answer. And then the next, what makes a good success criteria? Well, if these are the indications that kids are moving forward and have met the goal, that's going to be helpful to you as a teacher and going to be helpful to them as learners, it's got to be linked to the goal. And I think I mentioned that, sometimes when I work with teachers, they finally end up with a really substantive goal that Charlie would be proud of. And then you ask for the success criteria, and sometimes I think, this has got no relationship whatsoever to the goal. And so making sure that they really are the performances of learning that you are looking for to tell you, and indeed to tell the students themselves, that they're on the way to meeting that goal. So they need to be linked, clear and closely aligned, closely linked to the learning goal. The next point is that just as the learning goals focus on the learning, so we need to make sure that the success criteria focus on the learning as well. Not on the doing, but are these performances of learning. They illustrate the expected learning. So what are the indicators that show that you are learning what we want you to learn? So I, as the teacher, can use that, and the students can use that for themselves. Next slide, next point. Again, they need to be communicated to students, or as we saw in one of the videos, I don't remember the writing video that I showed, Miriam, where the teacher was actually co-constructing the criteria with the students based on a mental text. And then the final one, again, is they continue in alignment with the learning goal to support those rich, productive learning experiences. So what we were going to do now, and it's going to be hard for you to engage in this, Miriam, because you can't see the screen. So I'm going to suggest that we, this is one from actually a teacher in Iowa for Econ 1, and there's too much on the screen for you to really listen to and make sense of, Miriam. So I'm just going to leave it so that when you get the slides, I believe Paul's already emailed them to you, you can look at this and think about, do these meet the criteria of both the learning goal and the success criteria, and are they sufficiently grounded in the concepts and skills associated with economics? Paul, I'm not going to put you on the spot because we'll do that for the next one. So the next one is, okay, so this is a learning goal for a lesson that was part of a larger sequence of lessons. And I think this is one of the skills that you highlighted, Charlie, using evidence and making arguments, or making claims and supporting the claims from evidence. So the learning goal here, and this is middle school, was to use evidence to answer a historical question. And the question was, what kind of leader was Augustus, Roman Emperor Augustus? And the success criteria were to use source documents to develop hypotheses about what kind of leader. And in this particular lesson, the students for the first part of the lesson were given a map of the Roman Empire at the time of Augustus, and they were given a facsimile of coins from the time of Augustus. So these sources, and the next criterion was to use evidence from source documents to support your hypotheses. So basically looking at these sources, these two evidentiary sources, develop a hypothesis based on, I guess, your reasoning, and then use evidence to support that. So let's hand it over to Charlie. Charlie, what do you think about this? Miriam, so before we ask Charlie, Miriam, were you able to get what I was talking about?
Yes, most of it I got.
Okay. All right, good. So over to Charlie then.
So what I really like about this learning goal and these success criteria is I think it falls very neatly into that inquiry model that we were talking about a little bit earlier. We're starting with a compelling question. What kind of leader was Augustus? That's a question that different historians, or amateur historians as our students are, can come up with different answers to and be reasonable, as long as they're doing what the success criteria is identifying. And that's really appropriately using evidence from these sources in order to support their hypothesis or claim. So really you have this compelling evidence. You're using an historical disciplinary tool in evaluating source documents from the time. I like too that the example you're giving shows with the map and with the coin that documents don't always have to be things that students read. The whole, different amount of artifacts and kind of engaging sources that students can get into visually and otherwise. And then they're really doing that critical thinking in a sense of looking at historical sources and coming up with an answer to their question, to this question, and then communicating or using that answer in some way to show how their evidence supports their hypothesis. So that's really that very neatly ties into the 4 steps that the framework calls out for in its inquiry design model.
And thank you, Charlie. And then this lesson goes on. I guess this is one class period where the kids work and then develop their hypotheses and discuss them and so on. And then in the next lesson, they're given 2 more source documents, one written by a contemporary soldier of Augustus, and I can't remember the other, but it's 2 different perspectives, contemporary perspectives on Augustus. And so the kids are then required to examine these source documents and review their hypotheses or their claims in the light of additional evidence. So that seems to me to be a nice example of how you are using building blocks to, as we discussed, so that the next lesson then would be, reevaluate your hypothesis, or reconsider your hypothesis, or review your hypothesis in light of the new sources that you've been given. And of course, that's what happens.
And that's such a transferable skill.
Yeah.
The context here is ancient history, but when we're talking, say, our understanding of current events or opinions on issues today as citizens, that ability to take in new information and reevaluate our opinions or our hypotheses on things, and kind of doing that is really a skill that is vital to participation in our society today. And I think too, what you get in a lesson like this, rather than a lesson where the teacher just kind of talks about who Augustus was and provides a conclusion to the students about what kind of leader the teacher thinks Augustus was, is this, there's some deeper thinking going on here with the students in their evaluation of these sources. When we provide students with competing claims or competing arguments, say, from contemporaries during that historical time, like the third and the fourth piece of sources that this lesson introduces, getting students to evaluate maybe which of those perspectives, why would they have different perspectives on the question, and then really evaluating which would you maybe give more weight to, and why. Not all sources are created equal, and kind of getting them to think through that process, I think is the way history needs to be taught.
Well, that's great, because I did take this from the Stanford history, whatever it's called, SHEG
group. Yeah.
Unfortunately, they don't put learning goals and success criteria, so I had to do it myself from the lessons. So maybe I should give them some feedback. But I thought it was a pretty good lesson and was showing what I wanted. And then, Miriam, if you think about this, all the discussions, all the kids' discussions in pairs as they're thinking about these source artifacts, the way they use evidence, the claims they make, these are all formative assessment opportunities right there embedded in the lesson. It's not that you are giving them a test at the end of the lesson and, multiple choice of, okay, check, this, that, and the other. But you're listening to their thinking, you're seeing how it's developing, you're asking the probing questions, you're making prompts, you are moving their thinking along in response to what they're saying and what they're doing. So the other reason I like this is because it's very clear to me how, as a teacher, I could obtain all sorts of evidence about their thinking, which is really what we're trying to get at here. And as Charlie said, it's transferable. So when you get these slides, Miriam, take a look at this one in particular, and then think about the one previously, that's middle school. And then I did have an elementary one, but I think we can pass over that. This was making maps of our classroom. I don't know what you think of this, Charlie, but the goal says today we're learning how to make maps of our classroom, that we have to represent a bird's eye view and show all the fixed points in the classroom, and then show how someone could walk around the classroom. So those are the criteria that students would have to be thinking about as they are learning how to make maps. I don't know what you think about that, Charlie.
I did see last month, I want to say, I was in a first grade classroom, and they were doing an activity very similar to this, where they were mapping, kind of drawing what their classroom looked like. And it was really helping them kind of understand, I would say, like spatial awareness, spatial reasoning, in a sense of how things relate to each other in the physical environment, and the use of symbols. That was another kind of big I would say, learning point. Like if it's a square, it represents a desk. If it's a circle, it represents this. And so
Oh,
giving
yeah.
that idea.
That would be another good criterion to add, the use of symbols.
Mm-hmm.
How about represent a bird's eye view with symbols? That's quite challenging for little kids.
It was. When I saw the first graders going through it, especially I think the orienting themselves in a sense of where, kind of due north was, in a sense, or where, if we put the door to the classroom here on the map, then kind of having that awareness of where the other features would be, making that transference was challenging.
Yeah, and that's why I put it that they'd have to show all the fixed points, get that idea, but also how you would navigate around these fixed points. So, okay, so it doesn't get total thumbs down then, because I made this one up. So Miriam, you can take a look at that then when you see my brilliant first grade, which has got, I would say, one thumb up from Charlie, 1.5 even. So we're coming to the end. I want to give you just one last chance, Miriam, to comment or to ask a question, or I do have one final slide or one final quote to share with you, but here's your opportunity.
I was just kind of reflecting on how I do my social studies. I tend to have them be in groups and discuss rather than just get the facts and, just learn it, memorize it.
Mm-hmm.
I would say small group work in social studies, I think, is a really important and good tool to use, or instructional strategy to use, because it is a discipline, I think, that lends itself a lot to students having conversations with each other, expressing ideas, and kind of building off of each other's ideas. So that's definitely a good place to be.
Yes, I agree.
And so, Miriam, perhaps one thing certainly that I took away from this is the inquiry component of this, and threading inquiry through the students' experiences. So perhaps that's another lens that you could think about with your groups. How much of the inquiry is there? Are they really investigating a question, and how are they doing that? So that's another sort of lens that you could think about. And when you get the slides, there's lots that Paul's put in there that I think will help you. So let's just end then with a quote from I Used to, But Now I. And this is from a teacher, and what this teacher says: I used to think that formative assessment was purely a form of assessing students at the end of the lesson. Now I see it as an overarching way of designing lessons so that the goals are made very explicit. Students are asked to explain where they are with their understanding, and that teacher feedback is an essential tool in guiding student learning. And of course, teachers can't give that feedback if they don't have a consistent understanding themselves of where that learning is. And that's what we'll be moving into next time when I see you face to face. We'll be thinking about designing lessons and including teacher responses such as feedback. Well, Miriam, I can't thank you enough for sticking with us on this. You've got really challenging circumstances, given that you can't even see the screen, but you've been an absolute trooper, so thank you very much. And
thank you.
I really want to thank Charlie. I mean, it's been great, Charlie. You've been so clear and so great. And I can say, as a learner myself, I've learned a lot in this session. I'll be a much better talker about formative assessment as a result of your input today. So thank you so much, Charlie.
Thank you.
And thank you, Paul, for doing the steering. Excellent, as always.